Welcome back here to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to move on really to a new subject, but almost continuing on with the last segment on talking about the Minnesota Vikings and now looking to their future with JJ McCarthy, drafting him 10th overall. And it seemed too perfect not to happen. JJ McCarthy talked glowingly about the Minnesota Vikings in the pre-draft process, as well as mentioning Kevin O'Connell and how certain he was that the next quarterback that they drafted was going to be the guy. He felt it. He was really adamant about waiting for the exact moment to do it, and he felt that this was the year to do so. And it might add a lot more pressure now to JJ McCarthy, but I think it is something that he is willing to accept and live up to because after months of rising, shuffling, moving all over people's draft boards, McCarthy did land with the Minnesota Vikings. It seemed like the perfect fit there, like I mentioned, and I personally had my doubts about Darnold and how they could have maybe had him as their starting quarterback. They still could if they don't feel JJ is ready, but to have him, Sam Darnold, as your only quarterback, I had my doubts about that. But they got the best of both worlds here. The ideal situation, like everybody says, having that bridge quarterback there to mentor the young guy until the young quarterback is ready to take the helm. And that is exactly what the Minnesota Vikings have in this situation. And from the standpoint of JJ McCarthy, leading up to the process, a lot was being asked of him where he wanted to go. With him rising so much, he not to say that he had the choice of going somewhere, but there were going to be certainly a good amount of teams that were interested in him and what would he have felt was the ideal situation for him to land in. And Minnesota did have to trade up one spot to secure McCarthy, but it always seemed inevitable for this to be the pick, and that is what the feeling was for JJ McCarthy as well. Joel Klatt of Fox Sports recalled seeing JJ McCarthy at Michigan's spring game a couple weeks ago, leading up to the NFL draft, in which he said, I ran into McCarthy as members of the 2023 team were there for their ring ceremony at the Michigan spring game. I got a chance to talk with him for a little bit about the draft process before asking him where he wanted to end up, and he told me that he wanted to end up in Minnesota. During the draft, leading up to the draft, there was all those rumors about the Commanders and them being interested in JJ McCarthy. How much would that weird top 30 visit that the Commanders had with all the top quarterbacks there, JJ, Michael, Jaden, Drake May, how much would that have played into them really considering JJ McCarthy at number 2? There was all this smoke around this whole situation, but JJ wanted to be a Viking throughout this whole process. The Vikings certainly were interested in him, and they didn't have to move up drastically into the top 3 to get him, which I think is the craziest thing of this whole situation. Yeah, they moved up one spot, but it wasn't anything compared to all the mock drafts that you saw with them trading both of their first round picks and moving up to number 3, maybe number 2, and getting JJ McCarthy. I think a lot more people, if that ended up being the case, would have looked at them with a weird glance, with a weird look on their face as to why would they spend so much draft capital to move up to get JJ McCarthy at 2 instead of Jaden or Drake. This couldn't have played out better for the Minnesota Vikings. They not only got JJ, but they also drafted the best, if not one of the best, defensive players in the draft in Dallas Turner as well with their other first-round pick. There was a lot of these things where this could have happened or this could have happened, but I think this couldn't have worked out better for the Vikings. And now you start thinking and pondering over the idea of when we could potentially see J.J. McCarthy start. I don't see it as impossible for him to start right away with how Jim Harbaugh has talked about him, Kevin O'Connell, obviously. The biggest thing is the talent that he has around him. You know, he's not coming in to try and win games for the Minnesota Vikings, if that makes sense. You know, Caleb is coming into Chicago to change that whole organization and be the catalyst, be the game changer, be the attraction to everything. He's supposed to make everything work. Same goes for Jaden Daniels to some extent in Washington. with the recent history that they've had at the quarterback position, he's expected to be this guy, the generational type of talent to change that whole narrative around their quarterbacks, change the trajectory of the Commanders. A lot of pressure, you could say, is on him. Drake May as well, not having the skill players available to him in New England compared to Minnesota. How's he going to manage all of that? I don't expect him to start right away, but JJ, I think, is in a unique situation where he doesn't have to go out there and win these games for his team because they already have those type of players in their roster, at least on the offensive side of the ball. One of the best, if not the best, wide receiver, Justin Jefferson. He can go out and win you games. You have T.J. Hawkinson, one of the best tight ends in the NFL. Jordan Addison had a very good rookie season. In the backfield, you have Aaron Jones coming off of a great momentum run there in the playoffs against the Cowboys and against the 49ers. All of these positions around you really makes your job a lot easier, not to mention that your offensive line is one of the better ones in the NFL. So having all of that, you don't need to look to JJ to rally the troops, make game-changing plays, throw for 40 times a game, throw 3 touchdowns and over 300 yards. You're not asking JJ to do that. You're just going in there with JJ as your quarterback and really doing something that he's already accustomed to in Michigan with all those great players around him. I'm not saying that he just went out there trying not to mess up, trying not to lose. He certainly stepped up in moments that he had to, but that's really the key that I'm trying to make here. Only stepping up and making the plays when you have to, being the so-and-so hero when you have to. You don't always have to do that, where in other situations, these other quarterbacks might feel the need to because they are looked at the guy, the player that has to change everything for this organization. JJ doesn't have to do that. It is a luxury, and it's not something that he's unfamiliar to, like I mentioned there with Michigan. So that plays into the whole equation there. If it does end up being JJ, the amount of excitement and attention that will be on Minnesota, I think, will really benefit this team. The whole NFC North, is really just filled with these young, really improved teams, which is another topic for another day. But JJ being added to this Minnesota team, just imagine the excitement that they have bringing in the new quarterback that could be the guy, like Kevin O'Connell has said, with all the talent and weapons around him. It would bring a lot of excitement to them. And what's interesting about this, and having Sam Darnold there as a bridge quarterback, it is fascinating to see how that plays out, how Sam Darnold, because this is also a situation for Sam Darnold in trying to get something going with his career, a high draft pick as well, has been serving as a backup. This is a good opportunity for him to, show out for other teams if this isn't a long-term option for him, sort of like a Baker Mayfield to some extent. To hold off J.J. McCarthy, I think would be a very impressive thing to do with how much J.J.'s been talked about. And maybe he might not stay long there with the Minnesota Vikings, but that's also something that he could benefit from. And just the last thing I would say on this topic, how interesting looking down now, 7-10 years from now, the connection that all these quarterbacks are going to have with each other is going to be ridiculous with how early all 6 of them went in the top 12, I want to say. How many records they broke for offensive players taken, the records for quarterbacks taken, or tying the record for quarterbacks taken in the first round. How connected Caleb, Jaden, Drake, JJ will all be for the rest of their careers. And the idea that for the rest of their careers, there's always going to be something there to look back on and see, oh, wow, like Caleb went first and Jaden went second. How did JJ end up going second to last out of all these quarterbacks? Just that dichotomy, that discussion people will have for years to come on how they develop, I think is really intriguing to see how it all plays out. I think they all really fell into great situations in totality, but how JJ wanted to always be a Viking and how, looking down the road, how people will look at this situation and think, how did JJ fall to the Vikings at that? I think is really interesting to monitor, to see how it all develops. The first year is always massive for these quarterbacks, how they step foot into the league, how they adapt to playing against grown men. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. I'm really rooting for JJ. I think this is a great spot for him. I think the NFC North, like I mentioned briefly, is going to be great to watch. I'm surely going to be tuning in, and it's going to be something certainly to see with all the young talent that they have in that division. But in the meantime, we will move on to the last break of the show. And on the other side, I'll continue talking about one of these young quarterbacks taken in this year's draft. Now shifting over to Jaden Daniels and how Washington ended up selecting him and what their idea is for him to succeed in the future under their guidance. So don't go anywhere. We have one more segment coming up in just a few seconds.